Hello, my name is Donnie Ellis, and I'm here for my final presentation for IH 204. So what I want to talk about here is how, with everything we've been talking about with global culture and all these other nations like South Korea and Japan and their rich culture, how China has seemed to lag behind due to its governmental structure. So in the modern era, where representative democracies are considered a pseudo requirement for many of the civilized nations we know, I want to explain how China's totalitarian communist government has created situations that have harmed its public image and greatly negatively impacted its growth of soft power and cultural development in more modern years and more recent years. So historically, China, if we looked at it, like when we began with the question of who, and we talked about Matteo Ricci, this man here, we talked about him going to China and all these Jesuit missionaries going to China to be enlightened by their technological and unique cultural developments that couldn't be found anywhere in the world. Even here, he says, it is a matter of common knowledge, born out of our own experience, that the Chinese are a most industrious people, and it may be logically concluded from the foregoing chapter that most of the mechanical arts flourish among them. So Father Ritchie is clearly saying here, China has a very unique and industrious people that are develop that are developing new things and are unique in many ways. And they seem to be very, very fluent in these cultural aspects of industry. And even then, the question who, just to reinforce this, Father Fouquet, who was continuing his mission to try and spread uh, the word of God, the Christian message, the Jesuit message to the Chinese. On his return trip from China, he brings back these crates and crates of books, trying to capture some of the Chinese ingenuity and culture that they had become known for, and trying to bring it to the king in order for France and the French country to be able to kind of grasp the similar or see what makes China so culturally successful. Another thing we've talked about, again, towards the beginning of the class, was the Silk Road and China's economic and cultural exchange of its certain products with the Western world in the 16 and 1700s. So the product silk, unique to China, is an art. It was an art form developed in China where these products would only be able to be shipped out from China and could be found nowhere else in the world and were unique to it. That, along with porcelain, where the product where Chinese learned how to shape it and create these wonderful, wonderful art forms that they would ship to the West, or take commissions from the West to do certain art pieces. These were unique forms of Chinese culture that traveled along the Silk Road here, again, from China in the east to the west. But as we see in more recent years, these kind of unique cultural developments that define China to the rest of the world just don't seem to define China in the modern era. So I want to talk about what's changed. They have shifted in more recent years since their communist revolution. China has shifted from a cultural powerhouse to an economic and military powerhouse, moving their focus from that of soft power through cultural development such as music and arts to a more hard power focused on their military and economic growth. Here's a picture of the Chinese military. Chinese military is currently the second largest in the entire world, behind that only that of the United States. And here again is a picture of one of their factories. The Chinese people, they focus a lot by using cheap labor into developing their economy by outsourcing much of their labor to foreign companies, which brings a lot of revenue into China. And so the biggest thing here I wanted to do was to compare how China to the other two East Asian nations we've talked about, so South Korea and Japan, and how even though that they're both from a relatively same area, how the cultural output is not equal between these three nations. So essentially the main thing we talked about with Chinese culture, especially in the modern era in this last section, was the web novels, uh, which were developed online and have their very own unique community and spread globally. And it is a very strong global presence, and it is a very good piece of culture to have. However, compared to something like Japan, so when I think of eh, China and culture, I think of history and things like that. When I don't really so much think modern, but the first image that comes to my mind when I think of East Asian culture would be things like Japan through the development of anime, manga, or food such as sushi and other things. And visiting, like for instance, Japan has an incredibly high rate of tourism for the size of their country. The developments of video games on a global scale. Japan has been able to transition their culture into one that is thriving and strong around the globe in a way that China just hasn't. Similarly is that of South Korea, right? We talked about K-pop and how the Korean wave was this movement to develop culture and all of these to develop culture for these countries around the globe, increasing their soft power, giving them much more influence than they would normally have without these very unique and unmatched forms of art that could not that just can't be found anywhere else. And the issue with China is, let me go back here. The issue with China is when we think of China, we don't think of all these same things. We don't think of this Korean wave or this uh, strong Japan movement. We don't, or cool Japan movement. We don't think of these similar movements from China to develop their culture. When we think of China, we think as a Western nation, as a foreign nation. Personally, I think of China as an economic and military powerhouse, not a cultural powerhouse, which it is completely capable of doing. So the only question to be asked is what can China do to shift this kind of global perspective from military and economic to cultural and artistic and developed? They need to shift their public image. This is an image of some of the Hong Kong protests against the Chinese government for restricting some of their freedoms as they're slowly reintegrated into the Chinese government. This has been these images like these, the Tiananmen Square massacre, things that portray the Chinese government in this negative light have been the forefront of the global image of China in Western nations for many, many years. And that's just not the kind of image you want to have when you're trying to develop culture or trying to gain global influence in ways other than just money and military power. So China needs to slowly, over time, shift their global image from things like this to the rich culture that they have. The Zodiac, the Taiji Buddhism, the Great Wall of China, there are these great and wonderful forms of philosophy and art forms that come from China. But in the modern era, we have a lot of issues associating these things with China because of how much we see their government in a negative light, how much we don't want to recognize this because we don't want to be able to relate these wonderful, beautiful things with protests against, with anti-totalitarian protests that show people fighting for freedom, fighting for their democracy, fighting for their right to express themselves. Seeing these images makes it hard for us to equate this with China, which in reality it still is. So, just as an overall conclusion to my project, China in the modern era needs to shift their public image. They need to shift from this totalitarian, controlling regime to one that's more accepting of new arts, freedom, tourism, things that get people to want to come to their country, things that make people say China is special in ways other than just they have cheap labor, they have these strong militaries, they have immense nuclear power. We don't want to think of things like that when we're talking about soft power. China needs to shift from that image and make themselves more appealing to the global public. Thank you. And this has been my presentation.